Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you this week is the development of a bionic pancreas that should help with type 1 diabetes management, the ongoing conflation of aluminium in vaccines, and various other subsequent diseases, pathologies, and disorders. FDA issues warnings about breast implants, and a fungus that develops poison to avoid the immune cells. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with a news release from the National Institute of Health. This is an American research organization responsible for primarily medical technology news, research, and publications, but also acts as a repository. The fact that they are publishing this news release means it's probably big news. It has to do with the development of bionic pancreas, bionic being, unlike the bionic man, a single implant, whereas bionic man had $1 million worth, or perhaps given the cost of developing this technology, he really just had one of these devices implanted during the clinical trial stage. Either way, this is big news for those who currently have type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is presented with the inability to produce insulin. This is generally understood to be because the beta cells in the pancreas that make insulin are destroyed by the immune system. This device replaces them in their role almost entirely. It will automatically deliver insulin as required and maintain blood sugar levels within normal ranges. This removes the need for regular testing, regular doses of insulin, and multiple kinds of insulin to be used. This sort of device is not entirely new. There are others out there that do something similar. However, those devices do require greater input from the user. This obviously adds an extra layer of difficulty. When you're asleep, you can't do anything, and there is still a requirement for a certain amount of monitoring. That means there's going to be painful pinpricks in your fingers regularly throughout the day. This device mostly mitigates all of that by acting as its own internal monitoring device and using its own internal algorithm to figure out how much insulin to provide at the appropriate time. The device is able to run entirely independent of any other input after the person enters their body weight when first initializing the device. No recalibrations, no resetting it, it just works, if everything goes as planned. However, as is the case with nearly all trials, it's unlikely to go as planned all the time and for everybody. Looking at the results, there doesn't seem to be a huge improvement to the maintenance of blood sugar levels. It went from 7.9 to 7.3% of glycated hemoglobin, that being a measure of somebody's successful maintenance of blood sugar levels. There was a significant improvement in the amount of time spent within targeted blood glucose ranges, which is about 2.5 more hours a day, or 11% more. That means that there's less risk from high blood glucose levels or sudden drops. Overall, the device itself can likely get considerably more refined and improved given time, and that this is a clinical trial. From that alone, you can imagine just what's going to happen going forwards, an almost entirely self-contained treatment for type 1 diabetes. Novel treatments are one thing, and they are the most difficult to develop, simply because you are starting from nothing. Something that you can do instead of trying to develop something from nothing is repurpose existing drugs. And in this case, a drug for erectile dysfunction might help with certain lung diseases. This time we're going to talk about Viagra, although you would probably know it by the medication name if you buy generic, which is sildenafil. Sildenafil itself was originally developed to be a treatment for high blood pressure. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work, because it did dilate some blood vessels while constricting others, and it led to the unforeseen but long since appreciated side effect of erections. The drug is somewhat complex, and the reality is that although it does cause vasodilation, that's only one of the concerns. Vasodilation has to be targeted, and by targeting it to the lungs, they found that there can be some benefit, particularly with things like pulmonary fibrosis and pulmonary arterial hypertension. The evidence for its association with these diseases and ability to improve them has been demonstrated in repeated clinical trials, although once it's actually been put into a drug for these conditions, it has been changed slightly. Rather than being one largish dose, there are instead 3 much smaller doses. This doesn't have the same effect in terms of erection, but it does help with dilating the blood vessels in the lungs, and this then helps with things like pulmonary fibrosis. It's been approved in a very small number of countries, and the most well-known of these is Canada. In Canada, it is sold specifically to treat these diseases, along with being sold at a much higher concentration as Viagra. This is worth mentioning not just because it's a weird confluence of different intentions for the development of the drugs in question, but that they can then use them in association with other medication again. Notable examples include things like tadalafil and vardenafil. These reduced hospitalizations and progressions of disease by nearly 13%. Repurposing a drug in this case is going to be a lot cheaper and a lot easier than two possibilities that are the alternatives. The first is simply lung transplants, which are a world of problems all themselves, or not treating them at all and watching them slowly die. Again, not a good option. Going from the area where we're developing cures and treatments to treatments that exist, and specifically vaccines, but more than just vaccines, claims that the aluminium in vaccines can then lead to asthma. This is simply untrue. Unfortunately, this is the same long-touted etiology of diseases such as given for autism and vaccines, autoimmune diseases and vaccines, cancer and vaccines, and all sorts of other diseases. It's not there to start with, but despite this, the story continues, and it is yet to die of its own accord. So we're going to try and put it to rest in this video. The big study that's being used at the moment is an observational study, and it was run by the CDC, so yes, they do have access to a lot of data, and they should have structured it well. They found that there was a positive association between vaccines with aluminium and asthma. That is, if they were given the vaccines before age 24 months, and they maintained asthma after that 24-month period. So far everything makes sense if all you're going to say is that there is an association. It's a relatively large study based on a good sample size. They're not making any bold claims, but they're saying, look, if you put these two things on a graph, they have some sort of correlation. The problem is when you go beyond simply stating that. The big thing here is that correlation does not equal causation, and since this is an observational study, you can only get correlation out of this. You can't say anything about the relationship between the two variables beyond the fact that, yeah, there's some sort of graph we can make with them. A 2-year-old with a pencil can draw a graph if you really want them to. It doesn't mean it has any real-world relevance. The problem with trying to tie this study and the aluminium within vaccines to things like asthma is that it seems to be the only disease that has any relationship, or more accurately, the only autoimmune disease with any relationship. When you looked at, say, fully immunized children and eczema, which is another autoimmune disease, that statistical significance went poof, and it was gone. Why would the body have one autoimmune disease react this way, but not another? So we yet again have an issue with the extrapolated consequences of this don't really hold up. But if we just assume for now that only asthma is caused this way, we then have to look at how this fits into all the other data that's out there and other research. The big red flag for anybody is going to be two things. One, if vaccines cause asthma, you would expect that there would be an association between vaccination rates and asthma rates. That is, as vaccination rates go up, so should asthma. The problem is we've seen something of the opposite. As vaccination rates go up overall, asthma rates have gone down. If you were to try and extrapolate out that research, you would find that actually it would appear that vaccines protect against asthma, which isn't what the research found. In fact, no researchers have claimed that, which is a problem. This is one of the big reasons why research like this should first of all be taken with a grain of salt and also put into proper context. Unfortunately, very rarely is this sort of finding put in the proper context, and it will be used by people to scare parents out of vaccinating their children. One thing that may or may not be appropriate to scare people with is the safety warning from the FDA about breast implants. The warning relates explicitly to those that are either filled with silicone or saline, and the concerns that there may be an increased risk of cancer from scar tissue around the implants themselves. The publication from the FDA was also specific about the consequences. That is, there was an increased risk of squamous cell carcinoma and lymphoma only amongst those with breast prosthetics or implants. A total of about 50 cases of various kinds of cancer in the areas described have also been noted by the FDA. Given the number of implants conducted every year, and given some people the number of repeated implants conducted every year, this number is very small, and so, although there may be an incidence rate, we don't know what it is. We do know that relative to the number of procedures, it's not a very big number. The other caveat that the FDA has pointed out is that the kind of cancers that can develop from this aren't easily, if at all, detected on a mammogram, which means more careful observation and checking is required for those who have implants, given that the other medical methods may not work as intended. Going from things you can do to yourself, or have done to you, to things that can kill you from the outside, or if you're really unlucky, from the inside. A particular kind of yeast, Candida albicans, is being shown to be able to grow limbs which allow it to attack the immune system. These limbs also allow it to release toxins, thereby either occupying the immune system with the toxin or killing the immune cells outright. Candida albicans is not an uncommon pathogen. It's one of the most common means of getting a yeast infection, so it's likely that this is an adaptation that's occurring over time. The way it works is that the fungus generates a small spore-like structure. This small spore-like structure is engulfed by macrophages, one of the immune cells that's responsible for cleaning up damaged areas and removing foreign pathogens. In this case, it picks up the hyphai, and the hyphai begins growing and turning into a long pointy object. This effectively perforates the macrophage and causes it to become disrupted and eventually destroyed. The hyphai itself also happens to have several proteins on it that help with breaking through the macrophage's membrane. After all, the macrophage is intended to pick up any and all pathogens. If any of them could do this easily, its role would be, well, moot, as they would all easily escape once consumed. Some of the downstream effects of interrupting the macrophage's activity this way are that it dampens the inflammatory response, and this means the body is not able to recognize and deal with an infection so easily. This can then extend the time frame to deal with it and give it a much better chance of becoming established. That's just one of the possibilities, as there are others. Fungi are not the only disease that humanity is still struggling with. Unfortunately, there are parts of the world, like Zimbabwe, that continue to have to deal with measles. Measles is one of those things that an effective and practically universal vaccine exists for. It's why throughout most of the developed world, measles is a foregone issue. We've long since managed to eradicate it, and children get the vaccine now purely to protect them. Unfortunately for Zimbabwe, this is not so true. They actually have a great deal of difficulty getting enough vaccine, and for long enough to be able to give every child the needed dose. Because of this, since an outbreak in April alone, 700 people have died, and unfortunately the vast majority are children. This is only made worse by religious groups, traditional leaders, preachers, and anti-vaxxers spreading a message about the bad things to do with vaccines. Or it should be more accurate to say the made-up bad things about vaccines for the most part. Because measles is highly contagious, and it can have some very nasty consequences if you don't die, like sterility, permanent scarring, and more, you want to be vaccinated if possible. This was then further compounded by issues to do with COVID-19 and how that interrupted provision of vaccinations for measles. Going from modern medical issues to ancient medical issues, and studies of the Mayan cultures, specifically how ancient Mayan cities appear to have had very high levels of mercury. Mercury is another nasty metal, notably because of the effect it can have on the nervous system. If you happen to know anyone older than 50 or thereabouts, you may hear stories about when they were in school and were able to handle mercury without wearing any gloves. And many of those people now are seeing the consequences of mercury poisoning, particularly that their peripheral nervous system doesn't work very well and they can have issues to do with motor spasms and the inability to properly control their movements or have sense of touch. This is where the investigation of Mayan ruins comes into play particularly. It appears that their cities all had a heavy amount of metal mercury in the top layers of their soil. Mayan culture was somewhere around its peak about 500 years ago, and yet the contamination is so bad today that researchers are being advised to wear PPE when in that area to protect themselves. Imagine how bad it would have been 500 years ago. The origins of the mercury are currently being speculated, but there is one leading theory, and that is a red pigment that is made from mercury called cinnabar was used extensively throughout Mayan cultures because it was very much the color of blood. Mayan religious practices involved the blood of either victims, sacrifices, or however you wish to view them, but also painting the areas the red of blood was a way to practice their religion in a manner of speaking. The problem with this is that by practicing their religion, they were also spreading mercury all over their religious sites. It's not just ancient Mayans who can make mistakes. In fact, humans have made mistakes all throughout history, some more stupid than others. For example, invading Russia in winter, always a bad decision. Putting pineapple on pizza, often a bad decision. Saying it'll be over before Christmas, nearly always a bad decision. Cooking your chicken in Nyquil as a challenge, definitely a bad decision, but probably not one as widespread as currently thought, or at least that's according to Snopes, and take that how you will. Snopes has published their article explaining that there's a good chance that it was largely not a particularly prevalent challenge, that it's gained most of its attraction and traction through the rebellion against authority, primarily from the FDA warning telling people not to do this. As you can imagine, this has come from social media, and the predictable culprit can be found: TikTok. Our final news item for you this week is a final result of DART, DART being the Double Asteroid Redirection Test. The idea is fundamentally to send a small spacecraft into space, hit an asteroid, and knock it just a little bit off its current trajectory. By doing that, you can substantially alter its course of travel, enough so that if something larger or, for example, more dangerous were heading towards Earth, you could avoid any catastrophic ending. The final messages and images that DART sent back to Earth before its inevitable demise are considerably more, is in some ways more optimistic than what Mars rover's final message had, where it read, "My battery is low and it's getting dark." In this case, rather than the translated machine speak, we instead have images of its impact, like a train crash in slow motion. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.